Good evening to everybody. Welcome to our third installment of the Pasture Management Series. This is October 26th, and we're excited. We finally, I hope, for many of you, we've got a little bit of rain, and with a little bit of rain, it brightens everybody's day. But we've had a beautiful month, and let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing going on in our pastures and where we're going to go from there. So. Just to recap real quick, this is kind of the format we're going to go through for tonight. We're going to talk about what we're currently seeing out in our pastures at this moment, what to be looking forward to over the next month, and then any questions that you guys may have regarding steps that we're seeing or steps that we'll be looking to take over the next month. So as I'm driving around over the last month, this is kind of a snapshot of what I'm starting to see, and unfortunately, it's not much different outside of some temperatures. It's not much different than what we've seen the previous month. Pretty dry. What rains we have had due to the excessive dryness that we've had. A lot of the rains have come down pretty fast and pretty furious, so we've not seen as much absorption as we would like to see. We'll probably have a lot more runoff where some of our low-lying areas and our streams are filling up a little bit quicker, but we're not getting that deep absorption into the soil for that really good root growth where a lot of our roots are starting to take place. So where we're at tonight is most of all our summer grasses are done growing for the year. If they're an annual grass like crabgrass or Dallas grass, those have gone ahead and died and are brown and providing very little, if any, nutrition value at all. Our Bermuda grasses, if you've got some zoysia grass creeping in, but mostly Bermuda grass, common Bermuda grass, we're starting to see that. There might be a little bit of green left in it as it slows down, but for the most part, it's going into its dormancy stage. And growth-wise, it has completely ceased from that point on. What we're also seeing is decreasing soil temperatures. As the daytime temperature continues to rise, that still plays an important fact, but the nighttime temperatures at which we're starting to dip to plays a big role. And we'll talk about that a little bit in what we're projecting out over the next month. But with our decreasing soil temperatures, that plays a really big role in us being able to plant and get any seed germination, but also it's going to control the ability for those grasses to start to go into a dormant stage, even for our cool season grasses. Unfortunately, we're at a point where this year is just one of those that Mother Nature wins, where our summer grasses have really tailed off really at the beginning of the month due to the nighttime temperatures continually dropping. That started to slow down dramatically. Our summer grasses, June took care of a lot of our cool season grasses like fescue. And so through the month of October, we probably got left with a situation where a lot of us were probably having to resort or should have resorted to feeding hay, because our pastures weren't necessarily providing the nutrition for our cattle, horses, goats, or whatever that may be. So a lot of us were adding an extra month and a half, 2 months of hay feeding where we would traditionally not have that. We're starting to add that to our bill to maintain our good quality nutrition for our animals. So invariably it asks the question, are we waving the white flag for this year and just say, hey, Mother Nature, you win this one, we'll try again next year? And so we'll try to answer a few of those questions, but I know I continually get that question of what do I do? And I should have picked a magic 8-ball to work with this, but it's really hard to determine and make that decision without being able to know what the future predicts. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but case in point being, I think there was a rain that happened about a week and a half ago where it happened on a Thursday night where it was nowhere in the forecast. And so if we would have had any idea, we could have planned maybe some seeding around potentially that. but not being in the forecast kind of came upon us and changed a lot of our plans. So we'll talk a little bit about factors to think about as we decide whether we're going to wave the white flag and kind of change our method or our approach, or if we're going to try something a little bit different. So looking ahead, we're going to talk a little bit about evaluating our pasture status for tonight. How, I've said from the very beginning, this is one of the best times to be able to evaluate where your pastures are at and where you would like to be going. We're going to talk a little bit about growth, because I think this is the basis for everything you do with your pastures, is how to evaluate what you're doing, how plants grow, how grasses grow, and the impacts of the decisions you make on how they will impact whether that grass is going to grow, succeed, or fail. We're talking about reassessing our strategy. We kind of have this plan where we're going to do this. We've talked about through August and September, we're going to do this, this, this. Well, Mother Nature didn't provide a lot of those options that we had hoped to be talking about. So let's talk about reassessing what that strategy might look like. And most importantly, we want to talk about investing or protecting our investment, whether it's an investment that we made over the past few years, or it's an investment that we've already made this fall. We want to talk about how we can best protect that investment. So we'll get into it. So when we started talking about this, I referenced in September that October, right around that first frost, which came earlier than predicted, was the best time to evaluate what type of pasture you have going on. We talked about being able to make that decision whether your pasture was, do you have a 60% stand? Do you have a 70% stand? Do you have a 30% stand? We're talking about like a cool season forage. And when everything is green, it's really hard to be able to completely determine, without really knowing each individual grass. And even then it's kind of difficult to assess what you have going on. And so with the high cost that it takes to be able to reseed or overseed, you want to make sure that you're doing the right thing and getting the best investment in return on your expenses. So it's hard to do. So sometimes we can put off some of those decisions by waiting for a good time to evaluate our pastures, evaluating them, and then preparing over the next year to make that decision. So for those that were waiting intentionally or unintentionally, we had our first frost, and so right now is a great time to be able to go out to your pasture, even to your lawn if you want to, and evaluate: do you have a warm season pasture? Do you have a cool season pasture? Do you have a warm season annual? Whatever that may be, because you're going to probably have patches of green and you're going to have patches of brown. A lot of the green most likely will be some type of perennial cool season, probably like fescue that's growing on right now. So it should be green, green as can be. And then you probably will have lots of brown, whether it's brown crabgrass, Johnson grass, if you're looking at hay fields, or it could be Bermuda grass. And so this can help you determine what you've got going on in your pasture. Well, why is this important? This will help you to determine what you have going on this spring, but it's also a good indicator that if you're looking to do any type of nutrient treatment like fertilizer, is you know what type of grass you have going on in your pasture. So if you have what you see down there at the bottom, which is a warm season pasture that is very brown, if you do any type of fertilizer treatment during the springtime, this type of pasture is not going to be in active growth. So when you go to apply fertilizer, it's not going to be able to utilize the fertilizer before it's actually gone. So the fertilizer is going to either leach through or volatilize and go into the air prior to this warm season grass like Bermuda starting to warm up, starting to activate, starting to actually grow. So that would be a lost return for you. So if you have the grass on the left, that might be a good opportunity. If you were considering doing a fertilizer treatment, that would be a good opportunity to go ahead and apply fertilizer. That type of grass situation, you'd actually see some growth coming from it. So that's something to look at. So we take this advantage to be able to look at our pasture status, be able to evaluate what kind of pastures do we have, when do we need to take action with some of these? When will some of them take action? And then you can start to evaluate where you want to move forward with them. The next thing I want to look about, and I want to spend some time talking about here, because this to me is the biggest key for all the things you're going to do with any grass at any point in time all throughout a year, is how is growth occurring? And I don't know if anybody on here or anybody that will be watching this video has rolled the dice and decided to do some reseeding. But most likely this top left-hand corner picture is what their grass seedling is just starting to look like. Hopefully it was beyond this stage when we had the freeze a couple weeks ago, because this type of seedling right here will be extremely susceptible to freeze if we did get some of those temperatures. So hopefully it was past that, or just now at that point right now. But you can see it's a very thin blade of grass. And so in the bottom left-hand corner, you can kind of see the progress that each one of these individual seedlings starts to make. As it starts out as the seed in the ground, it starts to come up where it finally emerges. It starts with a couple of different roots. It finally starts to emerge one single stem. It starts to pop up. You can see that there is very little root system that is actually holding that grass in the ground. It's one of those that if you almost look at it, you can almost make it disappear. So any type of movement, you can imagine a horse or even a cow or even a goat or dog being on a grass or on a ground that has these new seedlings. They are extremely vulnerable. They can be displaced or removed very, very quickly and very easily. As it starts to develop multiple leaves, multiple tillings, you can start to see, more importantly, you see growth out of the ground. But what you see out of the ground is typically what you're going to start to see below the ground. You start to see more root development, still one stem only, but at least it's developing more of a root system for two things. Not only can it have a better opportunity to hold itself in the ground, but also it has a better way to be able to access more water. So on a day that it may be very dry, like we have had over the past couple months, any type of rain that we get that can get its way into the ground will actually be able to access it. Versus it may, if it dries out very rapidly on top, it's not going to be able to access any nutrients. So as these seedlings start to develop, they start to develop deeper roots, stronger roots, so they're able to sustain any type of activity. But you can still see anything that is grazing. Anytime you have this type of individual stem seedling, any type of action on top of this surface is invariably death for that plant. So if you put an animal out there, or you put any type of horse, cow, goat, sheep, whatever that is, immediately after you're starting to see these, there's very little chance that you're going to get much survival rate of any of these plants. So that's why we go back and talk about having the ability to kind of pull animals off, have the ability to have patience to be able to put the animals back on. It's not always an opportunity that everybody can take advantage of due to the land availability and animals, but anytime that you can give those fields an opportunity to lay fallow, it's a great opportunity. So if you look at right now how growth is occurring, so this is what you're seeing right now, and this is what you would probably see by next springtime. You'll see it's formed into a clump of grass. So a few of these have come together, they have expanded, and they have clumped. And so you're starting to see a thick clump of grass that's formed, and something that actually can withstand being grazed, something that won't necessarily pull out of the ground if it's grazed. Right below here is an example of a picture that I want everybody to see, is what they're seeing above ground, especially as we're heading into this winter, especially as we're, if you think back into this past summer and going forward into the future summers. But this is a good snapshot of what you're seeing. So when you look at your grass above the ground, it doesn't matter It's any type of cool season forage that doesn't involve a rhizome. And a rhizome, we'll talk about a little bit later in a different series, is warm season grasses actually that have the root system that kind of runs along the top of the ground. But these roots clump below. And so this is what happens if you graze a plant. Let's say it's 12 inches and you graze it down to 6 inches. So we've taken off 50% of the fodder or the forage that is on this plant. You can look at the root growth only shrinks by 50%. So if we take off 70% of the plant, look at how much more the root growth has shrank. And if you look at what we see, which is taking off 90% of the plant, which is pretty common in a lot of our pasture situations, look at the root growth, how much it has shrank. Once again, that plays a role in two factors. One is the ability for that plant to access water, which is extremely important when you're in a drought. The first top portion dries out extremely rapidly because of the wind. So we see this plant that has only 90%, and even the plant that has 70%, can only access a small amount of depth to access water. The next part is when you start looking at where you've taken off 90% of the fodder or the forage component of it, you see the corresponding roots are about the length of the plant that's exposed on the top of the ground, but it has very little capacity to be able to hold itself and anchor itself into the ground. So any type of movement, especially during the winter, when we start to talk about animals being on our pastures during the winter, any type of movement, which a lot of it is very wet ground, animals are kind of moving and sliding, you have very little ability for that plant to be able to hold itself in the ground where an animal doesn't slide across and uproot the entire plant. And these are established plants. So it's especially true when you're talking about plants that are not yet established. So that is why it is so important when you're first seeding, is to give it plenty of time to grow. But also when we start talking about this winter, we start talking about trying to pull some of our animals off our pastures or reduce access, or reflecting back into the summer when we talked about trying to let some of your pastures rest a little bit during the intense drought or intense heat, is what you're seeing above ground is what we're seeing below ground. And that's going to play the biggest difference in that plant being able to survive the winter or the summer. So as we go into this next section, it's talking about what can we be doing right now. We came in with this game plan. We've been thinking about this. We've been planning it out. I get burned by this every so often, where I say, we're planning for every year. We're planning for the fall. A lot of our strategies as we work throughout this next year, we'll be planning that we do a lot of our planting time during the fall if we're doing some cool season forages. Well, what happens in those times when Mother Nature and fall don't necessarily cooperate? What do we reassess? What do we start to do? So some things for us to be starting to talk about as we go through what's reassessing our next strategy based on what we're seeing on our pastures. First, I want to encourage you is, hey, if we have to, let's set up a time for a farm visit to reassess that, especially during the winter. We've got some time. We can be thinking about different strategies. But as we come up to, we talk about fall versus springtime. We talk about planting. If we're doing any type of cool season planting, I never recommend planting during the spring. Even if it's a requirement, it's still not necessarily a recommendation, just because we know that the germination rate is going to be so much lower during the springtime. But so we talk about right now, do we have time to be able to plant anything? And that's as it's a little bit outdated reference, but a $64,000 question is, do we have time? If I typically would like to see the temperatures not falling really below the upper 40s, probably to low 50s at night, and I still want to see daytime temperatures in the mid 60s to 70s. That's an ideal time for it to be growing. If, so something to make sure is right now when your temperatures are falling, our soil temperatures are falling, it's going to take 10 to 14 days probably for a grass seedling to emerge. Then once that emerges, that grass seedling is extremely vulnerable to freezing temperatures. If you have a newly emerged grass seedling and we get a freezing temperature, it's going to kill it. If you can get 2 to 3 weeks of growth on that grass seedling where it had good daytime temperatures in the mid 60s or 70s, that grass seedling can get up and get going and set a hardiness and be able to survive the winter, not necessarily survive animals being on it, but survive the winter. Now the question is what's November going to look like? We're kind of rolling the dice. I'd say odds are for something like a fescue, it's probably not a really good, the odds are really not in our favor that we're going to get that perfect weather condition to be able to happen. But we have had warm November, so you just have to, you can roll the dice right now if you're by putting fescue on right now, but odds are traditionally November is not going to provide us that long of window. So is there something faster growing than fescue that can get up and going? And so you start to talk about different annuals, like a ryegrass that maybe that has an option. It's a much faster growing. It will establish itself much quicker, like a winter wheat. It'll get up and get going a little bit quicker before, and can get that hardiness set before the cold temperatures. Still probably rolling the dice to be able to make all that happen by typically what I like to think of as November 15th as being a time that really you're going to roll the dice. It's going to be very difficult to get it up and get it set before then. So we start to think about, okay, what's a spring option? And as we start to go, and that's something we're going to consider is ryegrass or a winter wheat might be a good, or spring oats might be a good option for us to consider in the spring. And as we start to go through this over this next couple months, we'll start to evaluate whether that's going to be a good option. But that will be the only time I would really recommend it, is probably looking at probably a rye, an annual planting like rye or winter wheat or spring oats. We have to look at that annual versus perennial. Like I said, we just talked about rolling the dice. The only situation right now that I would really probably consider is if you've got an area that is highly erodible and you're really desperate to get something there, I would consider probably a ryegrass as an opportunity to put there if you've got a very highly erodible area that you really would like to get something going. And then we'll consider once again is trying to do a spring planting if we're really desperate for getting a spring grazing grass, where we maybe have a summer grass that's there and we really need to access some grazing for the spring. That's where we'll talk about maybe doing that for this coming spring, since we're not going to put a perennial. I probably would not invest in the perennial. It's going to be very unlikely that you're going to get a good hardiness set or have an opportunity this spring to plant it, because it's probably not going to get a good root system established before the summer heat comes on. So we started talking about weed control. Are there some options for weed control? So if you didn't plant, now we can talk about, do we want to do weed control now? Do we want to look at it later on this winter, or talk about early spring? So if your plan is to do some planting either now, you definitely don't want to do any type of weed control. If you're talking about doing some planting this spring, that might be something we're going to consider doing now, or more than likely, if we can find that 60-degree window, 4 days of 60 degrees in a row, looking for that window, we'd be looking at that as an option for during that around sometime midwinter, so that we could do some planting in early spring. So that's something to consider. Is if you're deciding you're going to have to do some planting, we'll try to do our weed control between now and that planting time. For new seedlings, if you've got something that you've just put in the ground and it's just starting to go, You typically like to have about 4 potential cuttings that you would use if you're trying to mow that down to, let's say, 4 inches. You want to have, you would like to have about 4 inches probably on that grass before you do any type of herbicide treatment. So most likely that's not going to occur for you until at earliest middle winter, if we get some nice days in November. If not, it's probably going to be early to mid spring before you're going to do any type of herbicide treatment for those. And nutrient wise, this is a great time. You can still apply your lime, potassium, phosphorus if your soil test calls for it. If you are doing a fertilizer, if you've got a very new planted some seedlings right now, you can apply that now. But if you've got some established grasses, you're just looking to put some fertilizer on. It's not recommended because more than likely by the time that grass goes to really fully utilize that fertilizer, the nighttime temperatures are cooling down, the daytime temperatures are going down. So that grass is getting ready to go dormant. And so you'll never really utilize that fertilizer. So most likely that's probably, we're going to punt on doing any type of fertilizer at this point, just because we're not going to get the return on that full effect. So the fourth area that I really want to highlight as our last section is protecting your investment. And I'm talking about if for nearly every farm that I go to, but especially those that are on small acreages, the heavy use area is by far the greatest investment that you can make on your farm to that you're going to get a return in so many different areas. You're going to reduce pasture destruction. We talked about once again when that grass is at its greatest vulnerable area, which is during the winter, during the summer when it's so hot and dry. You can be able to pull them off of that grass, put them on this dry lot where you feed a lot of your hay. Not only that, it's going to improve the appearance of your property. Most of us are surrounded by lots of neighbors, or our back deck looks out on our pasture, and we want to see a nice pasture. It doesn't have to necessarily be a perfect pasture, but we want it to be pretty nice. And so if anytime that we can, where there's a lot of opportunities for Mother Nature to be working against our pastures, it's a good opportunity for us to pull our animals off and be able to put them on some heavy use areas, whether you're feeding hay to cattle or you're feeding hay to horses or whatever that may be. Having some of these for round bale feeding, square bale feeding, great opportunities to reduce the erosion and control on our properties. They're, like I said, once again, they're good areas for reducing frustration. If you've been feeding hay, taking hay out during the middle of the winter, and your horses and your cattle are standing in 6 inches of mud, it is frustrating. When you're having to walk through 6 inches of mud, it is extremely frustrating. And so this gives you both an opportunity to both be out of the mud, to reduce some of the waste. You can clean up the wasted hay a little bit easier. They'll sometimes clean up the hay that falls on these surfaces because it's not falling in mud, it's falling on these heavy use areas. And so you don't necessarily see as much waste, and it improves the overall health of your animals. Obviously, the biggest challenge is the initial upkeep and cost. There is a cost to being able to develop and build these. Part of it depends on what surface you're trying to currently build this on, but that's your greatest probably detriment, is being able to just pay for the initial cost of it. But it is by far one of the best returns that you're going to get for your overall farm and pasture. And real quick, we'll go through, and it's a little blurry, and so I apologize for that. But the concept is very simple. You just have to adapt it to what you see going on your farm. Is you're going to dig down to the existing hard pan, whatever that may be. For some of you, you may be on a slab of rock and you don't have to go but a few inches. Others, you may need to go 12 inches or more to hit something hard pan. The idea is you hit a hard pan, and that whenever you start to then apply the geotextile cloth, which is extremely important to put that geotextile cloth, that's one of the most important aspects of it. That cloth holds whatever materials that you're going to put on top of that in place. If you would just go ahead and throw those materials, rock and limestone, on top of the existing ground, over time, it's going to start working its way into the soil layer, and you'll always be losing. You're constantly fighting the fact that you're losing your material. By putting that geotextile cloth, that keeps that material there. And by going down to the hard pan, you keep your initial integrity of the pad, versus if you go down a couple inches, that fabric will start to work its way and start to form to the contours of the ground. And so you'll still have to be constantly adding material. So go down there, add the geotextile cloth, come back in with the coarse rock, about half of that, and then on top of that, add the other half, which would be our ground limestone. Now, you don't want the powder kind. You need to have the very small particle size limestone. The great thing about this surface is it's permeable. It's kind of like concrete, but the water works its way through it. But we're still left with almost like a concrete surface. So it's very easy to clean material, old hay, manure, whatever that off of it, but provides a good stable padding for your hay and for your animals to be able to exist on. So once again, by far one of the best, if not the best, investments that you can make into your farm is adding, whether these are heavy use areas around the barn, which we would typically see maybe more for animals that are stalled or lean-to, like horses, or some small cattle operators, small cattle feeding areas where you might use it for like a hay pad, or if it's out in your pasture and it's just a small area where you consistently feed hay throughout the winter. These are some of the best investments you're going to make. So that wraps up what we're going to talk about for tonight. Unfortunately, that we have a little less than a month for our next session. Our next session will be on November 16th. We're going to talk about actually finding ways to improving our pastures during the winter. A few different strategies for you guys to be thinking about. We'll talk about seeding clover, whether that works for you. And how the process of going about doing that over the next few months. And then we'll talk about doing some weed control. What weeds are we looking to control? What situations would we do it in? And then what type of herbicides might we use if we were going to do some weed control? So just because it's getting cold doesn't mean that our pastures stop getting our attention. This is actually probably the best time to be thinking about doing something with your pastures. And this is some of the best times. What decisions you make now will have the biggest impact over the next year for your pastures. So say thank you to everybody tonight. And I wish everybody a happy Halloween, and we will see you shortly. So